I grew up believing that families moved forward by habit, not by decision. Breakfast at the same time, the same chair at the table, the same phrases recycled until they stopped sounding like words and became furniture. Nothing in our house was discussed as strategy. It was discussed as how things are. My sister Helen was 3 years older than me. That gap mattered when we were children. It mattered less once we were adults, except in the way she carried it, like a credential she didn't need to mention. She spoke with the calm authority of someone who had already passed through whatever room the rest of us were standing in. If I hesitated, she didn't rush me. She waited. Waiting was her version of pressure. Our parents had money, but not the kind that announced itself. No obvious luxuries, no sudden upgrades. The house stayed the same size. The car got replaced when it stopped being reliable. What changed quietly were the professionals. Accountants appeared, then a second one. A lawyer who came to dinner once and was never mentioned again. My father called this tidying up. My mother called it making things easier later. Helen was present for all of it. Not visibly. She didn't hover or ask questions in front of me. She simply happened to be there when conversations drifted past the kitchen doorway, or when my father lowered his voice. She was helpful in ways that were difficult to refuse. She drove our mother to appointments. She organized paperwork into neat piles that lived in labeled folders. She had a way of asking for signatures that made it feel like you were doing her a favor by not reading too closely. I left home in my early 20s, not dramatically, just gradually. A job in another city, a rented apartment that never quite felt temporary enough to leave. I visited on holidays. I called on Sundays. I thought distance would protect me from whatever gravity existed in that house. I was wrong, but it took years to understand how. When my father had his first minor stroke, nothing officially changed. No announcements, no family meeting. Helen increased her visits. I adjusted my schedule to come down more often. Our mother began repeating herself. Small things at first. Where she'd put her glasses, whether she'd already paid a bill. Helen filled the gaps seamlessly. She didn't correct our mother. She redirected her. There's a difference, and I would learn it too late. There was a particular conversation we had every visit. It became a ritual. "I've put everything in order," my mother would say, usually while stirring something on the stove she didn't need to stir. "So you girls won't have to worry." Helen would smile and say, "You don't need to think about that now." I would say nothing. Silence felt respectful. It felt like trust. The first document I ever saw was by accident. I was looking for an old photo album in my father's study when I found a folder labeled simply with our family name. Inside were copies. Trust documents, not originals. I didn't understand most of it. Percentages, roles, titles like executor and beneficiary, arranged in a way that made my eyes skim rather than focus. Helen's name appeared more often than mine. I closed the folder and put it back exactly where I'd found it. I told myself there were reasonable explanations: proximity, availability, responsibility. She lived closer. She had children. She had always been better at handling details. Her daughter, Anna, was 8 then. Quiet, observant. She sat at the table with a book while adults spoke around her as if she were furniture too. Helen liked to say Anna was old for her age. I noticed she listened when people thought she wasn't. She absorbed tone more than words. Years passed. The stroke was followed by another, then a fall, then a slow recalibration of what my father could and couldn't do without assistance. Helen's role became formal without ever being announced. She handled calls. She coordinated care. She spoke to professionals and relayed information secondhand. When I asked questions, she answered them. Precisely, briefly, as if there were nothing more to say. "There's nothing you need to worry about," she would tell me. "It's all handled." Handled by whom was never specified. I began to notice how often paperwork was described as already done. How decisions arrived fully formed. How conversations started at the end rather than the beginning. "We've decided it makes sense," Helen would say. Who was we? I didn't push. Not then. I was busy building my own life or telling myself I was. There was comfort in believing that someone else was managing the inevitable, that I could remain the daughter who showed up with flowers rather than the one who read fine print. The first time my name disappeared entirely, I didn't notice until much later. It happened after my father died. The funeral was efficient. Helen had planned it months in advance without telling anyone she had. Everything went smoothly. People commented on how well she was holding up. Our mother leaned on her physically, one hand always at Helen's elbow as if tethered. Afterward, there were forms, death certificates, bank appointments. Helen told me what I needed to sign. She slid papers across tables with practiced ease. I signed where she pointed. "Just standard," she said. "Nothing changes." I believed her because I wanted to, because grief is exhausting and suspicion takes energy, because she was my sister. In the months that followed, routines reasserted themselves. Sunday calls, holiday visits. Helen spoke more often about the estate, though always vaguely. Our mother stopped mentioning it entirely. It was as if the subject had been gently removed from her vocabulary. When I asked about specifics, Helen said, "It's complicated, but it's fair." Fair is a word that shuts down further inquiry. It implies balance without showing the scales. Anna was a teenager by then, taller, sharper. She began to accompany Helen to appointments, sitting quietly with a notebook. I asked once why. "She's learning," Helen said. "It's good for her to understand how things work." I smiled and agreed. It sounded responsible, educational, normal. The truth is, nothing felt wrong yet. Not exactly. What I felt instead was a narrowing. Fewer points of entry. Fewer opportunities to participate. The family story was being told in a voice that wasn't mine, but I couldn't yet articulate what had been omitted. Years later, I would look back on this period as the longest phase of the entire process, the part where nothing dramatic happens, where trust is not broken but quietly repurposed, where absence does the work of exclusion. At the time, it just felt like growing up, like stepping back to let someone else step forward, like adulthood. I had no language for what was forming around me, no proof, no confrontation, only patterns. And patterns, I would learn, are how systems remember. After my father died, time didn't move forward so much as it rearranged itself. Weeks filled with tasks I hadn't known existed before suddenly ended, and then there was a long stretch of nothing that felt heavier than the activity had. My sister thrived in that space. She was excellent at aftermaths. Helen took over my father's chair at the table without comment. Not ceremonially, just one day she was there, sorting mail while our mother drank her tea. No one remarked on it. We all noticed. The house began to change, not physically at first, but administratively. Bills that had once arrived addressed to both parents now came in Helen's name for convenience. She explained this as efficiency. It was easier for one person to manage things. I agreed because arguing would have meant admitting I didn't understand what was being managed. There were meetings I wasn't told about until afterward. "We spoke to the accountant," Helen would say casually during our Sunday calls. "Nothing you need to worry about." That phrase again, "nothing you need to worry about." It was said kindly, as if she were protecting me from an unnecessary burden. I thanked her for taking it on. When I visited, documents were everywhere but nowhere specific. Folders stacked neatly, never left open. Laptops angled away. Phone calls taken in the hallway. I would ask how things were going, and Helen would give me outcomes, never processes. "We're consolidating some things. We're simplifying. We've decided this makes sense long term." The decisions always sounded reasonable in isolation. It was only when I began to notice how often "we" didn't include me that a quiet discomfort settled in. It wasn't anger. It was disorientation, like walking into a room you know well and finding the furniture rearranged just enough to make you hesitate. Our mother aged quickly after my father's death. Not dramatically, but steadily. Her sentences shortened. Her patience thinned. She relied on Helen for cues. When Helen nodded, she relaxed. When Helen frowned, she grew anxious. It was subtle, but it happened again and again until it felt automatic. I asked once whether we should review the will together, not confrontationally, just as a suggestion. Helen smiled the way she always did when she wanted to close a subject gently. "There's really no need," she said. "Dad made his intentions clear. Everything's in place." "Have I seen the final version?" I asked. She paused, not long enough to be obvious. "It hasn't really changed," she said, "just updated for clarity." Clarity for whom? I didn't ask. Months passed, then a year. Life continued elsewhere for me. Work, relationships, routines that had nothing to do with my family, but there was a persistent sense that something important was happening without me. I started noticing the absence of small things. I stopped receiving copies of financial summaries I used to get automatically. Invitations to meetings ceased entirely. When I mentioned this, Helen said, "Oh, those were just courtesy copies. They stopped sending them." Who had asked them to stop? Anna was 17 then. She had grown into her quietness rather than out of it. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, it was with a precision that startled me. She had begun referring to assets and arrangements with a familiarity that didn't match her age. "We'll probably restructure that," she said once, overhearing Helen on the phone. "It's inefficient as it stands." Helen laughed, proud. "See? She gets it." I wondered when she had learned. The first real sign that something had shifted irrevocably came in the form of a letter I didn't receive. I only learned about it because Helen mentioned it in passing. "The trust sent out notices," she said. "Routine stuff." "I didn't get anything," I said. She looked surprised, then unconcerned. "Oh, they must still have your old address." I hadn't changed my address in years. I let it go. I always let it go. That became the pattern. A missing email, a delayed update, information arriving filtered, summarized, softened. I was always told what mattered. I was never shown why it mattered. When I asked for copies, Helen provided them promptly, redacted, highlighted. The parts I might have questioned were always framed as technicalities beyond practical concern. "You'd need a lawyer to really dig into it," she said once, not unkindly. "It's boring stuff." Boring is another word that discourages attention. The more I observed, the more I noticed how decisions were justified retrospectively. Outcomes first, rationale later. There was no space to disagree because there was nothing presented to discuss. Everything was already done. At a family gathering one Christmas, an offhand comment from a cousin unsettled me more than any document had. "So you're set up pretty well," she said, smiling. "Helen's really made sure of that." I asked her what she meant. "Oh," she said. She mentioned it when we were talking about trusts, how she'd arranged things so the next generation wouldn't be complicated. The next generation. That night, I lay awake in my childhood room, listening to the house settle around me. I thought about timelines, about how long it had been since I'd been asked what I wanted, about how often I'd been reassured instead. The truth, which I was still not ready to admit, was that I had been gradually repositioned, not removed, not excluded outright, just shifted to the periphery, where consent could be assumed and silence interpreted as agreement. Years earlier, I would have said Helen was doing what needed to be done. Now I began to suspect she was deciding what needed to exist. I didn't confront her. I didn't demand explanations. Instead, I started paying attention in a different way. I noted dates, names, language, who signed what, and when. I began asking professionals questions framed as curiosity rather than challenge. "I'm just trying to understand how this works," I would say. They explained willingly, not because they were betraying Helen, but because nothing I asked violated protocol. I was learning the structure, not accusing anyone of misusing it. Anna watched me during those conversations. Her expression was unreadable. Once when we were alone, she asked, "Are you worried about something?" I considered lying. Instead, I said, "I'm trying to understand my place in all of this." She nodded slowly. "It's complicated," she said. "It always is." I wondered whose words those were. By the end of the second year after my father's death, I understood something I hadn't before. Nothing had been taken abruptly. There was no single moment of loss. What had changed was access, and access, once limited, reshapes everything else. I still didn't know exactly what I had lost, but I was beginning to see the outline of how, and that, I would learn, was enough to start. After my father died, people kept asking me if there had been a change. They meant a visible one, a fight, a split, a disagreement over the will, a sharp moment where someone took a side and someone else finally said something they couldn't unsay. They asked the question with that quiet appetite people have for a story they can understand quickly. I always said no, and that was true, in the way most truths are true when they're missing the point. What happened in our family wasn't a change. It was an arrangement that hardened, slowly into permanence. The kind of permanence that isn't declared. The kind that settles into routines and makes itself feel inevitable. The first year after my father's death was full of tasks that made me feel useful while keeping me uninvolved. There were forms to sign, funeral bills, meetings that were explained to me after they happened, phone calls where Helen told me what had been decided. I didn't resist. I was still in the mindset of help where you can. Don't get in the way. I thought grief had its own protocol and that the best thing I could do was keep things smooth. Helen excelled at smooth. She had always been better than me at being calm in front of other people. She had the kind of calm that made professionals trust her. She spoke to them as if she already understood their world, even when she didn't. She asked the right questions. She used their language. She signed things without looking uncertain. In the early months, that competence felt like a gift. "You're lucky you have her," people told me. I smiled. I agreed. I believed it. When I came down to visit Mom, Helen was almost always there already. Sometimes she'd be in the kitchen moving quietly through tasks, not like a guest, but like the house belonged to her. Other times she'd be at the table with a folder open, pen in hand, phone resting against her shoulder, while she spoke to someone I didn't know. Mom would sit nearby, hands folded, watching Helen's face for cues. That was the first routine that repeated enough to matter. Helen would say something softly, nothing dramatic, just a phrase like, "Yes, that's fine," or "We'll go with that." Mom would relax as if the decision had been her own. Then Helen would hang up and say, "All done." Sometimes Mom would ask, "What was that about?" And Helen would answer the same way each time. "Oh, just paperwork, nothing you need to worry about." Mom would nod, relieved, and return to stirring tea or folding a towel that didn't need folding. She began to live inside those words. Nothing you need to worry about. So did I. The courtesy phase started as an act of kindness and ended as a system. Helen was courteous in the way people are when they're being efficient. Every conversation contained the same reassurance. She was taking care of it. She had it handled. I didn't need to burden myself. On my end, courtesy looked like not insisting. It looked like trusting her to do what she said she was doing. It looked like being grateful. I remember a Sunday call early on, the first one where I tried to ask something slightly more specific. "How does it work now?" I said. "With the accounts and everything?" Helen didn't hesitate. "Same as before," she said, "just with me as the point person." "Do we need to meet about it?" I asked. "Meet for what?" she said gently, as if I'd suggested meeting about the weather. "There's nothing to decide." That sentence was a door closing without a sound. I told myself it made sense. There's nothing to decide. Dad's intentions were clear. The structure was already set. There was no need for a meeting. That reasoning held for months, then years. The next routine was paperwork by proxy. At visits, Helen would slide documents toward me and tap where she wanted my signature. "This one just confirms you're aware," she'd say. "This one is a standard acknowledgement. This one is nothing, just a formality." Formality became another word that meant, don't read too closely. I wasn't careless. I was grieving. I was tired. I wanted to believe my signature was not consent to anything significant. I wanted to believe it was courtesy, and Helen never asked me to sign anything that felt obviously wrong. That's the point. She never needed to. She understood that you don't move people by force when you can move them by routine. I visited every few weeks. I brought groceries. I fixed small things in the house, replaced a loose handle, patched a fence, took Mom to appointments when Helen couldn't make it, which wasn't often, but often enough to make me feel included. The inclusion was its own kind of quiet control. It kept me warm enough not to notice the cold. Mom's decline was gradual. She didn't collapse into incapacity. She faded into dependence. It showed in small ways first: lost words, repeated stories, uncertainty about dates. She began to ask Helen the same question more than once. Have we done that? Did we call them? Are we meant to sign something? Helen would answer calmly every time, as if repetition wasn't a sign of anything. Yes, Mom, it's handled. Yes, we did. No, you don't need to worry. I remember watching Mom's face in those moments, the way she relaxed after Helen spoke. It wasn't trust in the abstract. It was a physical release. Helen became the person who removed worry. Mom leaned into that. And I stayed in my role because it was easier than trying to move the furniture of our family. The third routine was information arriving already packaged. Helen didn't say, "We need to decide whether to do this." She said, "We've decided it makes sense." She didn't say, "What do you think?" She said, "This is the best way." She didn't say, "Here are the options." She said, "This is what's happening." I noticed it. I didn't fight it. I told myself she had been closer to Dad at the end, closer to the professionals, closer to the details. She was simply translating it for me. That's what I called it in my head, translating. Except translation always involves choices about what to include. One example stays with me because it was so ordinary. I came down one weekend and mentioned an old insurance policy Dad had always talked about. I asked if it was still active. Helen glanced at Mom, then back at me. "Oh, we updated that," she said. "It's sorted." "What does updated mean?" I asked. "It means it's current," she said. "You don't need to worry." There it was again, the phrase like a soft blanket. I let it cover the question. Another time, I asked about the holiday house, the small coastal place we'd all gone to when we were children. Nothing impressive, but full of history. Dad had loved it. He'd always said it would stay in the family. Helen didn't even look up from her phone. "It's a liability," she said. "Too much maintenance. We're dealing with it." "Dealing with it how?" I asked. She smiled, patient. "We'll know soon," she said, and then she shifted topics, smoothly, as if the question had been answered. I left that weekend with a faint discomfort I couldn't justify. No proof, no conflict, just the sense that things were being described to me in a way that left no place for response. And that was the beginning of a new routine, my questions drifting into air and returning to me as reassurance. The courtesy phase also had its own language of delay. "I'll send you the documents. Once the accountant finalizes it. When things calm down. After the next review." Nothing was ever refused. It was simply postponed. Postponement is powerful because it doesn't invite argument. You can't confront someone for agreeing with you, just later. I began to notice how often later never arrived. One year, a trust notice was mentioned in a conversation with a cousin at a family event. Something about the annual update and the new structure for the next generation. I blinked. I didn't know what she was talking about. "Oh, Helen said it was all set," my cousin said brightly, "that it was much cleaner now, less complicated." Cleaner. There it was again. Efficiency dressed up as virtue. That night, I called Helen. "I didn't receive an annual update," I said. She sounded mildly surprised, not alarmed. "Oh," she said, "maybe they've got your old address." "My address hasn't changed," I said. A pause. just long enough to register. Then her voice returned to calm. "They send them to the primary contact," she said, as if I should already know what that meant. "It's normal." "Am I not on the list?" I asked. "You're a beneficiary," she said quickly. "Of course you're on the list." Those two statements didn't match. I didn't yet have the language to explain why. I hung up and sat in my kitchen staring at nothing, replaying the call. It wasn't what she'd said. It was how easily she'd said it, the certainty, the unbothered assumption that the system was arranged in a way that made sense, and that I would accept it because I always had. The courtesy phase ended, for me, not with anger, but with a shift in attention. I started noticing the micro moments, how Helen answered questions that weren't asked, how she offered reassurance when I asked for specifics, how she used Dad's intentions as a shield against details, how she framed everything as protection from stress. And I began noticing something else, how much of my role depended on me staying tired. Busy people accept summaries. Grieving people accept reassurance. People who don't want conflict accept it's handled. I realized I had been living inside that phrase for years, so I stopped letting it end the conversation, not by confronting her, not by accusing her, just by holding the question a little longer. "What is the structure now?" I would ask calmly. "It's the same," she would say. "I'd like to see it," I would say. She would promise she'd send it. She would sound sincere. Then weeks would pass. At visits, I began doing something small that felt almost ridiculous. I started writing things down, not emotionally, not like a diary, like a record. Date of visit. What Helen said was handled, what was being dealt with, what would happen after the review, names of the professionals mentioned. At first, it felt paranoid. Then it began to feel practical, because the same phrases repeated, but the outcomes shifted, and I needed something firmer than memory. There was one conversation with Mom near the end of this phase that changed the temperature for me. Helen had stepped out to take a call. Mom sat at the table with a cup of tea and stared at the window as if waiting for a cue that never came. I asked her gently whether she wanted to talk about the estate, about Dad's wishes, about how she felt. Mom blinked, confused. "Oh, Helen's done all that," she said. "She knows." "Do you know?" I asked. Mom looked at me as if the question was strange, almost inappropriate. "No," she said. "I don't need to. Helen's good at those things." There was no resentment in her voice, just surrender, a simple, content abdication. In that moment, I understood that courtesy wasn't just Helen's behavior. It was the family's agreement. It was the unspoken contract. Helen would hold the complexity, and everyone else would be grateful enough not to look too closely. I drove home afterward and felt something settle in me that wasn't rage. It was awareness, because I could see the future forming. Anna learning, Helen consolidating, Mom deferring, and me arriving, signing, thanking, leaving. I began to realize that if I didn't change my position, nothing would. Not because Helen would suddenly become cruel, but because she didn't need to. The system she was building required only my continued politeness. And politeness, in the wrong hands, is remarkably easy to use. Anna didn't step into the family structure all at once. She seeped into it. At first, she was simply present in rooms where she hadn't been before, sitting at the far end of the table with her phone face down, standing in the doorway while Helen spoke on the phone, waiting quietly while documents were discussed, never interrupting, never asking to be included. Helen liked to say Anna was taking an interest. "She's curious," she told me once. "It's good for her." Curiosity sounded harmless, educational, almost wholesome. I nodded and agreed, because disagreeing would have required naming something I still couldn't fully articulate. In those early years, Anna didn't speak much. She watched, and watching, I would learn, was her real apprenticeship. She watched how Helen spoke to professionals, not deferentially, not aggressively, but with the easy confidence of someone who assumed she belonged in the conversation. She watched how Helen framed decisions as outcomes rather than choices, how she used phrases like industry standard and best practice to end discussion before it began. Most of all, Anna watched what went unchallenged. When Helen said, "This is how it's structured," no one asked who had structured it. When Helen said, "Dad wanted it this way," no one asked which version of Dad that referred to. When Helen said, "It's simpler if..." Simplicity won by default. Anna learned those lessons quickly. I noticed the change in her language before anything else. The questions disappeared. In their place came statements that sounded oddly adult, oddly final. That doesn't make sense long term. There's no reason to keep it fragmented. You'd never do it that way now. She spoke as if time itself agreed with her. At family gatherings, she drifted toward Helen automatically. They stood together, heads inclined toward each other, speaking in low tones that signaled importance without revealing content. I would join them occasionally, but the conversation always adjusted subtly when I arrived. It became more general, less specific. I learned to recognize the moment when I had entered a room that was no longer meant for me. Helen encouraged Anna openly. "She's very sharp," she said, often within Anna's earshot. "She understands systems. She sees the bigger picture." The bigger picture was never defined, but it was clearly not the one I occupied. There was a meeting one afternoon, informal, unannounced, where I realized Anna was no longer just observing. Helen had invited an advisor to the house. I arrived halfway through, unplanned. Anna was seated at the table with a notepad, pen moving steadily as the advisor spoke. When he paused, she asked a question. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't framed as learning. It was corrective. I think that assumption only holds if the discretionary clause stays unchanged, she said. Otherwise, the exposure is different. The advisor blinked, surprised, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "That's right." No one commented on the exchange. No one congratulated her. It simply happened, and the meeting continued as if this were normal. I stood in the doorway and felt something shift. Afterward, Helen smiled at Anna with unmistakable pride. "See," she said to me, "she gets it." What Anna was getting, I realized, was not just information. She was getting orientation. She was learning where authority lived, how it moved, and how quietly it could be transferred. I asked Anna once when we were alone how she felt about being involved. She shrugged. "It's interesting." "Do you feel like it's your responsibility?" I asked. She considered this. "Someone has to understand it." That answer stayed with me. Someone has to understand it. Not everyone. Not we. Someone. I began to notice how Helen positioned Anna in conversations. She would say things like, "Anna's been looking into that," or "Anna's across the details." She deferred to her in small ways, publicly, building credibility incrementally. It was succession training, disguised as education. And it worked because it didn't announce itself. Over time, Anna stopped sitting at the edges of rooms. She took a chair at the table. She began receiving documents directly. I knew because she referenced things before Helen mentioned them. The updated figures show, the last review suggested. I started to feel something unfamiliar when Anna spoke, not resentment but displacement. It wasn't that she was wrong, it was that she was being positioned as inevitable. The future was being narrated in her voice. Helen and Anna developed a rhythm that excluded explanation. They shared shorthand, a look, a pause that signaled agreement. When Anna spoke, Helen listened differently, more attentively, more seriously. That shift mattered, because Helen had always listened to professionals that way. Now she listened to her daughter like one. I tried once to enter that space, not aggressively, just gently. "I'd like to understand how these decisions are being made," I said during a visit. Helen smiled. "You don't need to get into the weeds." Anna didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on the document in front of her. That was when I understood something crucial. The weeds were where power lived, and I had been carefully kept above them. Anna's confidence grew alongside my absence. She spoke about the trust as if it were a neutral object, something to be optimized, streamlined, future-proofed. She never spoke about it as something that belonged to people. That wasn't cruelty. It was training. One afternoon, long after Mom had begun relying on Helen for everything, Anna said something that made the shape of things unmistakable. "We should make sure the next generation doesn't have to deal with unnecessary complications," she said. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated just briefly. "I mean, it's better if things are clear." Clear for whom, I wondered, and clear in what direction? Mum nodded approvingly. She had no idea what was being discussed, only that it sounded responsible. Helen smiled. Exactly. That was the moment I realized the succession had already happened. Not legally, psychologically. Anna didn't need to inherit authority later. She was absorbing it now, piece by piece, while no one was looking directly at her. And I, by contrast, was becoming increasingly historical. The daughter who visited, the sister who signed, the person whose involvement was assumed rather than required. Anna never challenged me. She never dismissed me openly. She didn't need to. The system did that for her. When I asked questions, she answered politely. When I expressed curiosity, she offered summaries. When I fell silent, she filled the space. The distance between us wasn't hostile. It was structural. By the time Anna finished her formal education and moved into work that mirrored the family's financial world, her role felt natural to everyone except me. It felt earned even. And perhaps it was in the narrow sense that matters inside systems. But what no one acknowledged, what I had begun to see clearly, was that Anna's learning had required my non-participation. There had only ever been room for one successor in the way Helen imagined the future, and that successor had been chosen not through confrontation, but through proximity and permission. Anna learned because she was invited. I didn't because I had been spared the inconvenience. That was the trade. And once I could see it, I knew that nothing would change, simply because I noticed. Systems don't correct for fairness. They correct for pressure, applied in their own language. I wasn't angry at Anna. She had been shaped by what she was given, just as I had been shaped by what I wasn't. But watching her step into certainty made something inside me harden, not into resentment, but into resolve. Because I finally understood the timeline, the past had already been organized, the future was being rehearsed, and the present, the long, quiet present, was the only place where anything could still be altered. The first time I realized something concrete had shifted, it wasn't through a confrontation or a discovery. It was through a delay. I asked Helen for a copy of a document she'd mentioned in passing, an annual summary, the kind that used to arrive automatically. She said she'd send it. She sounded sincere, busy, but sincere. A week passed, then 2. When I followed up, she apologized lightly. "Oh, I forgot. I'll forward it tonight." She didn't. That pattern repeated often enough that I began to notice the shape of it. Nothing was ever refused. Everything was postponed. Each delay was plausible on its own. Together, they formed a quiet wall. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't disputing anything. I wasn't planning to act. I just wanted to see what existed. Curiosity, I told myself, was harmless. But curiosity has a way of sharpening once it's been discouraged. I began paying attention to how information arrived. Not what it said, but how it reached me. Summaries instead of originals. Explanations instead of copies. Outcomes instead of drafts. Helen had become a filter. When I asked about a bank account that Dad used to mention, Helen said it had been consolidated. When I asked where, she said it was under the trust now. When I asked for the statement, she said there wasn't really a statement in the way I meant. "It's all internal," she said. "It doesn't read like a normal account." Normal had become another word that ended inquiry. The first document I received that did not include my name was accidental. It was attached to an email Helen forwarded without checking closely enough. A distribution notice addressed to trustees only. I scanned it quickly at first, not really understanding what I was looking at. Then I slowed down. Helen's name appeared. Anna's name appeared. Mine didn't. I told myself it was nothing, that not every document needed to include everyone, that I was reading too much into formatting. But once I had seen that absence, I began seeing it everywhere. Meeting invitations that went only to Helen and Anna, notices that referenced the trustees as if that group were fixed and unquestioned, language that assumed decision-making authority existed elsewhere. I asked Helen directly, trying to keep my tone neutral, "Am I still listed as a beneficiary?" She didn't hesitate. "Of course." "Then why don't I receive notices?" She frowned slightly. "You don't need to. They're operational." Operational, another word that suggested irrelevance. I didn't argue. Instead, I did something that felt almost embarrassing in its simplicity. I called the administrative office myself. I introduced myself politely, gave my name, explained my relationship, asked whether I could receive copies of certain notices directly. There was a pause on the line, then typing. "I see you here," the woman said. "You're listed as a residual beneficiary." Residual. I asked her what that meant exactly. "It means distributions occur after primary allocations," she said, "and correspondence is generally sent to trustees or primary beneficiaries." Primary. Was I ever listed differently? I asked. Another pause, more typing. "Yes," she said. "Earlier versions included you as a direct beneficiary." Earlier versions, plural. I thanked her and hung up. I didn't call Helen afterward. I needed time to sit with what I'd learned, to understand the scope of it. Residual beneficiary. The phrase sounded technical, but its effect was deeply personal. It meant waiting. It meant conditional relevance. It meant that my inclusion depended on everything else resolving first. Nothing had been taken outright. My position had been reclassified. I began requesting documents directly, formally. I learned which requests I was entitled to make without triggering resistance. I learned how to phrase them so they sounded administrative rather than adversarial. "I'm updating my personal records. I need this for my files. I'd like to understand the current structure." Responses arrived slowly, but they arrived. What I saw was not a single moment of removal, but a series of small adjustments spread across years. Clauses amended, roles clarified, discretion expanded in ways that favored continuity of control. Each change, viewed alone, was reasonable, necessary even. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I asked Helen about the changes carefully. "They were made for efficiency," she said, "to avoid confusion later." "Confusion for whom?" I asked. "For everyone," she said too quickly. I noticed then how often she invoked the future, later, long-term, next generation. The present was always treated as temporary, even as decisions made there became permanent. Anna spoke about the documents differently. Where Helen framed them as protection, Anna framed them as optimization. "This version removes ambiguity," she said once. "It's cleaner this way. You don't want too many people involved." Too many. I wondered what number she had in mind. One afternoon, I asked Anna directly how she saw my role. She looked surprised. "You're part of it," she said. "In what way?" I asked. She considered this. "You benefit." Benefit. A passive verb. I realized then that in her mind, participation and benefit were not the same thing. One involved effort and authority. The other involved outcome. Waiting. The more I learned, the more I saw how my earlier politeness had been repurposed. My absence from meetings had been interpreted as consent, my lack of questions as trust, my trust as permission. Nothing in the documents contradicted that interpretation. They simply reflected it. The holiday house was sold without discussion. I learned about it after the fact when Helen mentioned the proceeds being reallocated. "Reallocated how?" I asked. "Where they're needed," she said. I asked for the breakdown. She promised to send it. She didn't. This time, I followed up with the administrator directly. They sent me a summary. My name appeared only in a footnote. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was assembling something more useful than anger: clarity. I began creating my own archive: digital folders, timelines, copies of every version I could obtain. I noted when changes occurred and who had authority at the time. It became clear that while Dad had set the initial structure, Helen had shaped its evolution, not maliciously, methodically, each adjustment justified by circumstance, each one small enough not to provoke resistance. The system rewarded proximity. It rewarded attention. It rewarded the person who was there to make decisions when others were tired or grieving or busy. That person had been Helen. I asked myself more than once whether I could have stopped this earlier, whether a single conversation years ago might have altered the course. But that question assumed there had been a moment to interrupt. There hadn't. There had only been a slope. By the time I understood what residual meant in practice, the structure was already stable. Challenging it directly would have required accusation, conflict, proof of wrongdoing that didn't exist. What existed instead was process. And process, I was learning, could be engaged without confrontation. I didn't announce my concerns. I didn't accuse Helen of anything. I didn't demand restoration. I did something quieter. I started learning the language the documents were written in, because once you understand the language, you stop being invisible. And invisibility, I had learned, was the real inheritance that had been assigned to me. There was no moment when I decided to act. What happened instead was that I stopped waiting for something to be revealed. Once I understood that my position had been reclassified, not removed, not erased, just quietly downgraded, I also understood that confrontation would be useless. Nothing Helen had done was openly wrong. Everything had been permitted by structures I hadn't bothered to learn while they were being shaped, so I learned them. Not all at once, not with urgency, with patience. At first, it was just reading, trust deeds, amendments, explanatory notes written in the dry, careful language that exists to avoid implication. I didn't read them as accusations. I read them as maps. I wanted to know where authority pooled, where it dispersed, and where it was simply assumed. What surprised me was how little secrecy there actually was. The system wasn't hidden. It was merely uninterrogated. The documents existed in drawers, on servers, in folders with names that suggested finality. They relied on familiarity to keep them unexamined. I began asking questions that sounded harmless because they were. How often is this reviewed? Who receives notice when that happens? What triggers an external confirmation? No one resisted. Why would they? I wasn't challenging outcomes. I was asking about process. Helen noticed eventually. "You're very focused on this lately," she said during a visit, her tone light but watchful. "I realized I didn't understand it," I said. "I should." She studied me for a moment, then smiled. "It's complicated." "Yes," I said. "That's why I'm reading." She didn't discourage me. She didn't need to. She still believed the structure would absorb me the way it had always absorbed my curiosity, politely, without consequence. Anna reacted differently. She became quieter around me, more careful with her words. She had grown used to being the one who explained things. Now she wasn't sure whether she should. I noticed that she stopped speaking in meetings unless Helen prompted her. The confidence she'd built on assumed alignment didn't vanish, but it recalibrated. She was still inside the system. She just wasn't sure anymore where I stood. I began contacting administrative offices directly, not aggressively, not frequently, just enough to establish presence. "I'm updating my records," I would say. "I want to make sure my information is current. I'd like copies for my files." Files became important, not emotionally, but procedurally. I learned that trustees had obligations not just to beneficiaries, but to the structure itself: reviews, reporting cycles, compliance checks that were often treated as formalities because no one asked too many questions. Formalities are fragile. They rely on silence. I requested historical reports, older versions, not because I expected to find wrongdoing, but because I wanted to understand evolution, how language shifted, how discretion widened, how oversight narrowed without anyone objecting. Patterns emerged. Clauses added after my father's health declined. Adjustments made during periods when grief made questions feel inappropriate. Language that framed control as protection and delay as kindness. None of it violated the terms. It exploited their flexibility. The first move I made that altered anything was almost invisible. I submitted a formal inquiry regarding reporting transparency. It was phrased carefully. No accusation, no implication of error. Just a request for confirmation that current practices aligned with documented obligations. It triggered a review, not the kind people imagine when they hear the word. No auditors descending, no urgent calls, just correspondence, requests for documentation, clarifications. It took months. Helen was irritated but contained. "This is unnecessary," she said once quietly. "Probably," I replied, "but it's allowed." Allowed mattered. The review required things Helen wasn't used to providing. Explanations in writing, justifications that could be read later, decisions that had once been internal now had to be framed as defensible. Anna watched this happen with growing distance. She wasn't defensive. She was recalculating. She had learned how systems worked, and now she was learning how they responded when engaged. The review concluded without drama, no findings, no reprimands. But something had shifted. Reporting obligations were clarified, notice provisions expanded, correspondence protocols updated. My name appeared where it hadn't before. I received my first official notice directly a few weeks later, addressed to me, not forwarded, not summarized. Helen didn't mention it. Neither did I. The change wasn't about what I gained. It was about what the system now remembered. Once a structure recognizes you as an active participant, it stops pretending you're incidental. That recognition couldn't be revoked without explanation. So I continued. Each year, I requested the same documents. Each year, I asked similar questions. I thanked people for their thoroughness. I noted timelines. I compared versions. I never raised my voice. I never accused anyone. I never framed my interest as grievance. I framed it as responsibility. Pressure entered the system not as force, but as presence. Sustained, consistent, unignorable. Helen adapted. She always did. She became more precise, more cautious. She stopped saying, "It's handled," without specifying how. Anna began withdrawing slowly. She took on other projects, other commitments, places where certainty still rewarded confidence. By the end of that period, nothing looked different from the outside. The trust still functioned. Helen was still in control. But control had weight now. It had to be carried in the open. And that was enough to prepare what came next. After control shifts, there is no sound it makes. No announcement. No moment that feels like a hinge. Nothing clicks into place the way you imagine it will when you've spent years watching pressure build. The system doesn't acknowledge the change because, from its perspective, nothing dramatic has occurred. It has simply adjusted to the inputs it was given. That quietness was harder than I expected. For a long time, I had imagined that when things finally moved, I would feel it. Relief, perhaps. Vindication. Some internal confirmation that the years of observation and restraint had been worth it. Instead, what I felt was a strange neutrality, like stepping out of a room you hadn't realized was loud until it went silent. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came not through documents, but through behavior. Helen stopped improvising. Where she had once spoken freely, confidently, assuming alignment, she now prepared. She circulated agendas. She confirmed language in advance. She waited for responses before proceeding. None of this was dramatic. None of it was hostile. It was simply careful. Careful is what people become when they know they are being observed. Our conversations changed tone. They became narrower, more factual. We spoke only about what needed to be addressed. There was no casual overlap anymore, no shared commentary about what Dad would have wanted or how Mom would feel. Those narratives had lost their usefulness. What replaced them was procedure. I noticed that Helen no longer tried to reassure me. She didn't say, "It's handled," anymore. She said things like, "This is scheduled," or "This will be reviewed." Language that left space rather than closing it. We never discussed the past directly. There was no reckoning, no clearing of the air. That kind of conversation would have required agreement about what had happened, and agreement was no longer necessary. Accuracy was. Anna faded from the structure almost entirely. At first, I assumed it was temporary, work commitments, other priorities. But time passed, and she didn't return. Her name stopped appearing on drafts. Her voice stopped shaping outcomes. When she did surface, it was peripherally, as if she were visiting a place she no longer lived in. I wondered, briefly, whether she felt displaced the way I once had, or whether she simply recognized that the certainty she'd been trained to expect no longer existed here. She never asked me about it. I never asked her. Distance settled between us, not cold but clean, a recognition that whatever had connected us before had been circumstantial, not chosen. Family gatherings grew smaller, less formal. Without centralized control, there was less need for choreography. People arrived when they could, left when they wanted. Conversations drifted. There was no one holding the narrative together anymore. I realized then how much of what we'd called family cohesion had been administrative. Without someone enforcing alignment, the family didn't fracture. It simply relaxed. People occupied the space that suited them. Some drifted away. Others stayed. No one pretended it was anything else. Helen aged during this period, though not in ways others would notice. Her posture softened. Her urgency dissipated. She no longer spoke as if the future were something she alone was responsible for managing. Once, years after the shift, she said something that surprised me. "You could have stopped me earlier." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't defensive. It sounded more like a reflection she hadn't meant to voice aloud. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I was choosing my words carefully, but because the statement itself felt incomplete. "I didn't know what you were doing," I said finally. "And by the time I did, it wasn't something you stop. It was already a system." She nodded. That was all. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Helen may never have experienced what she did as manipulation. From her perspective, she had simply stepped forward when no one else did. She had held things together. She had prevented chaos, and perhaps she was right. What she hadn't accounted for was the cost of continuity when it excludes participation. How easily care becomes control when it's never questioned. How responsibility, once assumed, resists redistribution. I didn't need her to admit that. I didn't need acknowledgement. The system no longer required it. Over time, the structure settled into something unremarkable, balanced, legible, ordinary. Decisions were made with documentation. Reviews occurred on schedule. Notices arrived where they should. My name appeared without explanation. That was how I knew the correction was complete. Not because I had gained something new, but because nothing about my presence needed justification anymore. I wasn't an exception. I wasn't a complication. I wasn't residual. I sometimes think about the version of myself who trusted politeness to protect her, who believed that not insisting meant not interfering, who assumed that silence preserved harmony. I don't judge her. She did what she knew how to do at the time. She believed, as many people do, that systems run themselves if left alone. They don't. They run on whoever shows up consistently enough to shape them. What was taken from me wasn't returned as apology or reconciliation. It returned as proportion, as presence, as the quiet authority of being counted without asking. That kind of reclamation doesn't feel like victory. It feels like alignment. There are still things left unsaid between us. They will probably remain that way, not because they are forbidden, but because they no longer serve a purpose. Some truths don't need to be spoken once the structure reflects them. The system still runs. It will continue long after any of us are gone. And for the first time since my father died, it runs without relying on my absence to function. That is enough.